So most of you were here last Sunday. We did our fall kickoff Sunday. And I spoke about the whole thing of just living on purpose, just really looking at all that we do as a church. And I said that it totally applies to each of us individually as well, applies in every ministry, everything that we're aiming to do as a church. I'm just going to run through the 5 things I mentioned real quick, just because I think it helps us all to have a reminder sometimes. Oh, yeah, right. So we said first and foremost, everything we're doing this coming year, it's about how can we help each other really, really love God. Above everything, first and foremost, that we're not just doing things out of duty, or, okay, this is just what we do. No, this is about really loving God in our actions, in our minds, in our thoughts, in our hearts. Secondly, help our friends discover Jesus. And I used 4 G words, which I have in brackets there. And Mark already made reference to this. Alpha is a fantastic tool. I think it's the best tool I've discovered in a lot of years. I feel totally free to invite people to this, and I am, and I do. Thirdly, living in vibrant, healthy community. We really believe that the church is God's idea, but it's not just about coming and leaving. It's about being community. It's about connecting with each other. It's about building relationship. It's one reason we emphasize the whole thing of our small groups, our life groups. Fourthly, see all of us grow to become more like Jesus. I really hope that I myself, and I pray that for all of us here, that we will actually be different a year from now. That we'll be able to look at some areas in our life and go, wow, I've actually changed over the course of this year. I sometimes hear of older people becoming grumpy as they get older. I really hope and pray that I get more kind and more gracious as I get older. I'm hearing little things that I don't quite catch. I just heard the word grumpy over here. And lastly, we believe that Jesus modeled for us this whole thing of serving and genuinely loving others. In fact, Jesus himself said, I'm among you as one who serves. I mean, the King of Kings that we're going to worship and bow down to, he came to serve us. And so we believe that it's of utmost importance in all of our lives. In fact, we actually become more like Jesus as we choose to be ones who gladly do things for others, care about others, look outside of ourselves in terms of what's going on in other people's lives and how can I come alongside them. In official areas of service, whole bunch of you are involved in all kinds of areas in this church, and I think that's awesome. But it's way beyond that as well. It's also in what we do on a daily basis, wherever we are. So that's where we were last Sunday. Over the last number of months, we've been studying Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And lately, we've just been looking at his instructions to Christian households. So 2 weeks ago and the week before that, we talked first of all about husbands and wives, our marriages. And then 2 weeks ago, we spoke about children and parents. And so there's a third category that Paul deals with and that we're going to look at today, and it's the whole area of God's design for business relationships. Specifically, we're going to apply it to the whole area of employees and employers, but it goes way beyond that. All of us, doesn't matter who you are in this room, all of us are involved at different points in some kinds of, if we could use a broad term, of business relationships. Whether it's someone coming to do a repair in your home for something, it can be all kinds of relationships that we have. And it's crucial that we realize what a difference it can make if we function in all of those in godly ways. N.T. Wright, in his Ephesians commentary, tells a story of working on a construction site during his university years. He was building a factory. And he says, these guys were totally committed to doing absolutely as little work as possible for as much pay as possible. Until the boss showed up. And then he said they worked really hard the whole time he was there. So doing as little work as possible, and then because the job was on a timeline, they were always asked to work overtime. And so then they would work really hard for the first hour, and they would leave at that point, but they would convince the night watchman to put the punch cards in 3 hours later. And so in reality, they got as much work done in that 1 hour as they normally did during the day in 3 hours. And so they got paid overtime for those extra 3 hours, and he was told, well, this is just normal practice. That's just how we do things around here. Nicky Gumbel actually tells a very similar story in the Alpha course. He says that also in his university years, and also in Britain, I don't know if this is how they do things in Britain, but he tells of being on a road crew and shoveling, and he says all these guys, they just stood on their shovel all the time, they just stood around. And he said, well, that's just how we do things around here. So I've certainly heard of various cases also of where people are trying to do as little work for as much pay as possible. Well, this is exactly what Paul was addressing in our passage that we're going to be looking at, where he's telling slaves to not only do their work when their masters are watching, but to always be consistent in what they're doing. If he said it to slaves, how much more does it apply in our culture in terms of employees and all the different business type relationships and situations that we're going to look at? How we function as employees or employers, and I know that some of you are excluded in that because you're retired now, but I believe it also applies in various situations there. How we function in those different business dealings speaks volumes to people about God. Whether we pay our bills promptly on time, whether we're a hard worker, regardless of whether someone is working or watching, what our attitude is in the things that we do. Poor business practices, on the other hand, on the part of Christians, can be very detrimental to the gospel. And I've heard personally, and I'm sure you have too, heard examples of that. I can't believe the guy says he's a Christian, and look what he's like. and speaking specifically about the whole area of business. So one thing that I want to emphasize before we even read our passage is, if there's one thing that comes out of this, it's the whole thing that our whole lives are spiritual. For you and I to do the best we can on our jobs tomorrow, if you're working tomorrow, that's spiritual. It's not unspiritual to have your mind in it, to have your heart in it. We sometimes think to be spiritual, I should be thinking about God stuff the whole time I'm working. No, you should be doing your job. You have to think about your job. At least most of you have to think about your job. So, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6, and we're going to read verses 5 to 9 there. I have it up on the screen here. I'm reading from the NIV, but you can read along as well. So Ephesians 6, verses 5 to 9. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So obviously he's addressing slaves and masters. I'm applying it to employees and employers, and I believe it's an appropriate application, appropriate correlation. But the passage does raise, for some of us at least, the question of, at least I've heard it asked at different points, how come Paul doesn't just outright condemn slavery? Why is he even talking about things within the context of slavery in terms of how people should function there? And by the way, he does condemn very specifically slave traders in terms of that practice. But slavery at this time, I'm going to talk about this a little bit because it does raise that question for us at different points. Slavery, it seems, during this time was a universal practice in the ancient world. In most cities, there were actually way more slaves than there were free people. John Stott, in his commentary, says, slavery was so completely accepted as a part of the labor structure of the time that one cannot correctly speak of the slave problem in antiquity. It wasn't seen as a problem. It was just seen as this is life. This is how things function. To abolish slavery during this time with a single stroke would have actually resulted in a complete disintegration of society. I saw a quote in my NIV study Bible, a little bit longer, but I thought it was actually worth quoting here, and so I'm going to do that. Question they ask is, why wasn't there a massive slave revolt in the first century? And then they quote another commentary from Zondervan. There is no evidence in ancient literature of a slave rebellion with the abolition of slavery as its goal. Why? Not only was Roman-era slavery a non-racial institution, there were slaves of all races, but most slaves could reasonably expect emancipation, getting set free, by the time they reached 30 years of age. Nor was the work of a slave limited to hard labor. Slaves worked in a variety of different occupations, including household management, teaching, business, and industry. And many even owned property. Because of the poverty of many free laborers, the economic and living conditions of slaves were often far better. This led many free laborers to sell themselves into slavery as a means of economic advancement. This is not to deny that slavery was essentially an ungodly structure that deprived a person of freedom and dignity. It is simply to affirm that Roman-era slavery did not share all the same features of New World slavery that would ignite a rebellion. So, I think it's worth saying that at least. That's not to say that slavery was a good thing. Masters generally saw slaves as property, not as people. And there were certainly slave owners, masters, who were harsh and unkind to their slaves. But Paul is instructing slaves and masters here how to function within the given structure. The best correlation I can think of is when Jesus tells people of that time, he says, if someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the left as well. Now, he's not saying that the one doing the slapping is doing something that's right. He's just speaking within what's going on around here. He does the same thing with, if a soldier tells you to walk 1 mile, go 2 miles. Now, again, he's not saying that's a good thing. He's just saying, you know what? God calls us to do something that's beyond the norm. And so within what was going on in that day, he talks about how do we best function as believers in what's going on in our culture. We could give similar instructions with things that we might look at going, this isn't quite what it should be. Okay, but within that, how should we function? How would God have us do things day to day? So, the other thing that's noteworthy is that Paul addresses both masters and slaves. In fact, the fact that he does address slaves here as part of the church is significant, because in that culture, they would not have even really been seen as people. They would have just been seen generally as property. But he addresses them as brothers within the church. And that's important in terms of how they were viewed within the church. In fact, in our passage, he goes even further in verse 9 to say to both slaves and masters, he says, hey guys, there's no favoritism. The master's not above the slave. Before God, you're both on equal ground. And again, I think that's very important for us to see. As we saw with the other household instructions, what's really important is that we all look at what's God calling me to do. What's so tempting sometimes, some of you might be employees here, you go, yeah, I need to make sure my boss does what you're telling them he should be doing here, or vice versa. No. Let's look at what God's called us to do. Doesn't work too well in marriage if husbands, you go to your wives and say, hey, you should be doing this, or vice versa. Same thing with employees and employers, okay? Let's look at what's God telling me to do out of this whole thing. So let's jump in. Sorry for a bit of a longer introduction, but I think it was important. First of all, God's instructions for employees. By the way, he doesn't say nearly as much to the masters or the employers, but he does start off with saying, treat your slaves in the same way. In other words, everything that he's saying to the employees, that's the language we're going to use, he's also saying to the employers. And so right off he says, work as if working for Christ. In all four of those verses, it's very interesting that each of the four verses where he addresses the employees, in every one of them he says, you know what, behind your employer is actually Christ. Jesus is actually the one that you should be looking at. You're serving him first and foremost. Let me go through each of those verses really quickly. Verse 5, he says, just as you would obey Christ. Verse 6, obey as slaves of Christ. Verse 7, serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not men. Verse 8, know that the Lord will reward you. Pretty strong language and very instructional for us to really get the grid of, if you're cooking a meal at home, to think, I'm actually cooking this for Jesus. If I'm cleaning the house, I'm actually cleaning it as if Jesus is going to come and be the guest here. If I'm a student, I'm looking at how can I do the best for Jesus as my teacher. For teachers teaching kids, for doctors and nurses treating patients, if you're building a house, if you're serving customers, really having the mindset, I'm actually doing this for Jesus. It's not even about what kind of a boss do I have. It's actually about I'm doing it for the Lord. And everything we do to have that perspective of this is how I want to function. So, may seem a little redundant, but let me ask the question, how would that affect what you do? How many of you are employees here today? Stand up. Okay, you can sit down. How many are employers or self-employed? Well, we got quite a few. Wow, look at this. We're about half and half. I didn't realize we had that many. So, like I said, it says in the same way, employers, okay? How would this affect what you do tomorrow or the next day? If you're doing it to the Lord don't just parrot, well, I do it to the Lord. No, how would it affect what you do? Holler some things out. Attitude? Is that somebody say attitude? Yeah. Just your attitude of how you're very much so, okay? Respect, yeah, just having a respect for, yeah. The integrity and quality of your service is huge. That's good enough, it's just for Jesus. I don't think so. If that's what you would say, then you don't understand who Jesus is. Sorry? Honor, yeah, honoring people, having that attitude, huge. Patience with people, yeah. So, okay, not discriminating against people, okay? Okay, these things are huge. Claire talked about the integrity of our work. I believe it applies both ways. It applies if I'm an employee. It applies if I'm an employer. Hey, I want to do the best job I can. I think I can say this. I'm looking for a new mechanic. My mechanic that I used for a lot of years has some major health issues. And you know what I want in a mechanic? I want a mechanic who can do good work. But you know what I want more than anything? I want a mechanic that's honest. You've probably all read stories at different times. I know I have. This was years ago, I remember reading a Reader's Digest story, and they actually did a study. They went across Canada, and I don't remember what I believe it was that, for those of you that know a little bit of mechanics, he pulled the vacuum hose off of his carburetor before he pulled in and said, this car is running really rough. I don't know what's wrong with it, you know. And went across Canada, and he got bills of like pretty big bills for this. You know, okay, we'll bring it in the shop, we'll fix it for you, and okay, you can come and get it the next day. Sorry, you know, do us all this and this and this and this and this, and you know, sorry, it cost you $1,000, you know, to fix this thing. He actually got, I don't remember the exact percentages, but it was at least as many dishonest mechanics as there were honest ones. And he said, you know where he got the best service? It was just some kid pumping gas, and he kind of looked under the hood. Oh, your vacuum hose is off. Here you go. You know, put it back on for him. See you later. So, honesty. When we're doing work, we've got virtually as many employers in this church as we do employees or self-employed. You can easily just, you know, upselling. Okay, what else can we get them to take on, right? McDonald's tries to upsell you all the time. Would you like a large fries with that? Do we try to get people just to, yeah, as long as I get them to do this stuff, they don't really need it, but I'll charge them for it anyways, you know? Or are we really caring about our customers? That's spiritual. That's all part of spirituality. Your job is not a necessary evil. Do you know that work actually started before the fall? One of my Bible college teachers, Don Carson, some of you may have heard him. He's quite a renowned New Testament scholar these days. But he must have said this multiple times, because I remember him saying this. And he said, if you play hard. If you work hard. That stuff is spirituality. That's part of being a follower of Jesus. Just to go through our text there a little bit, he says, obey your employer with sincerity and respect. And some of you might say, well, of course, if I don't do what he says, I'm going to get fired. But he's talking about more than just doing what they say. He's talking about our attitude, which was mentioned over here somewhere when we were talking about that. Verse 5, he says, with respect and fear. He's not talking about being scared of the person. He's talking about the whole attitude of actually having reverence and honoring the person. That was mentioned by Nick over here. And again, remember, these things go both ways. By the way, in other texts, he says that they're to have these attitudes even to harsh masters. Respect. We often say, well, respect needs to be earned. Well, no, yes, that's true in some ways, but in other ways, in these kinds of situations, we're to have that attitude of respect for those that are over us. And really, respect like this comes first and foremost when we recognize Jesus is really the one who's behind my employer. He is really the one that I'm doing these things for. It's the attitude of wanting to serve the one I'm working for. And it's so obvious whether the attitude is there or not. whether the heart is there. That brings me to the next point here that he mentions, this whole thing of work wholeheartedly. And some of you might say, are you kidding? I hate my job. We're actually supposed to have our hearts in what we're doing, in the jobs that we're going to be doing this week. Verse 7, he says, serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people. It includes this thing of without hypocrisy, without ulterior motives. So God's concerned about the whole thing we do. Everything we do is spiritual, like I said before. And it makes all the difference when we're working from this kind of attitude. Another passage that relates to what we're talking about, Colossians 3:23 and 24. Beyond work, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And just jumping right off that verse to verse 8, realize that the Lord will reward us. You may think at different times in your employment situation or in business dealings that you are involved in some way. We all face things, that wasn't quite right, or that was unfair, and yes, there are appropriate things we can do there with right attitudes. But it's interesting that he emphasizes this thing of, know that the Lord will reward you. Classic example, obviously, is Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. I mean, talk about someone who got a raw end of the deal. Was sold as a slave by his brothers, first of all. I think most of you know the story. Then, he's in Egypt. Then he gets thrown in prison because he's unjustly accused. But in prison, he continues to function godly, godlike, if you want to use that language. He continues to be an example of a follower of Yahweh. And guess what happens? He gets promoted. He gets promoted in prison, and he eventually gets promoted right to being second in command with Pharaoh. Wow. And we know the story of what happens, how God uses him to actually make provision for God's people. When they eventually come to Egypt, there's provision for them, all through someone that was faithful. Even when he got the raw end of the deal, he kept being faithful. And secondly, we'll just touch on this briefly because so much applies both ways already, but God's instructions to employers, as already said, Paul says, treat your employees the same way. For those of you that have workers, you can think of different ones right now. If you hope to receive respect, give it. If you hope to receive service, give it. However, we would hope our workers would respond to us, let's do the same to them. I know my experience of having had some Christian employers way back was very positive. I felt I really saw examples of people that cared, people that were appropriate. The things that they expected were very appropriate. And he says we're to do this with a sincere heart. We're to treat workers, employees, as if they were a child of the king. And then he says specifically, do not threaten them. Threats are the weapon of the powerful over the powerless. Jesus talks about godly leaders as ones who don't try to usurp authority. Doesn't mean that you don't tell your workers what needs to be done. You have to do that. That's part of what goes on, and it's completely appropriate. But how we do that makes all the difference. Leaders are to lead. Jesus never implied that leaders in the church even shouldn't give appropriate leadership. But again, how we do that makes all the difference. Don't use threats to manipulate in unhealthy ways. Of course, if someone's not doing their job, you have to appropriately say, you need to do what I've called you to do here. Thirdly, he talks about being right and fair, and this is actually not out of our Ephesians passage, again, out of the Colossians parallel passage. Masters, Colossians 4:1, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Paying reasonable salaries. You know what? I understand why this is, but I wish in our Christian schools that we would be paying the same as we are in our public schools. I think it's really sad that it's not that way. I understand why it's that way, but I believe we should do all we could to pay appropriate and reasonable salaries. And it goes across the board. And I know many of you, I know different ones of you as employers here. I know that that's your heart. I know that that's your attitude. Hey, I want to pay as best I can. And that's awesome. And again, let me say this. Some of you are retired and you may go, well, I'm neither one of these. But we all have bills to pay along the way. If you happen to have somebody that you had to bill for something, how long would you like them to wait before they pay you? Be prompt with paying your bills. Real simple, you know. Well, I want payment right away, but I'll wait 3 months to pay mine. Generous tipping. Yeah, very much so. All those things speak. It's all part of godliness. And then the last one he emphasizes here is realize who your master is, as already talked about. He says there's no favoritism, whether we're an employer or an employee. He says we're all the same before God in terms of value. Very important. And so I know this is kind of a nuts and bolts kind of a message, but I think we need to be reminded sometimes, you know what? It all matters to God. I've had people ask me sometimes, well, should I be trying to meditate on Scripture as I'm doing my job? Well, you can if that works, but for lots of you, you have to really think about your work. And that's God's intention. That's how he designed this thing to be. That's not unspiritual. That's right and appropriate. That's what we should be doing. And so in whatever place we find ourselves, I think business is one of the biggest areas where just what we're like speaks to people. Because invariably, people will find out, hopefully if we're letting our flags fly at all, they'll find out we're believers, we're followers of Jesus. What we're like speaks volumes to people. And I'm sure you've heard things on both ends of that. And I've heard some of you spoken of as, oh, wow, those are just, I'd love to have that person working for me. And sometimes the opposite happens. And so recognize how just an area like this makes all the difference for the kingdom of God. And it really can honor God. You know what? If someone finds out one of us is a Christian, we should be able to go to everyone else. I would gladly hire that person. Even if they're not the most skilled person, I know I'm going to get their best. On every level, I'm going to get their best. And I believe that kind of stuff really honors God. Okay, let's have the worship team come up, and we're going to do a song in conclusion. I don't know if anybody else had a word they wanted to share for this morning. If you do, and we know you, please come up and share that. I was really impacted through that song that we did about safe to shore, the boat one. I don't know what all the words are. Lighthouse, thank you. Because I was immediately reminded of when Jesus got in the boat with his disciples at one point and said, let's go to the other side. And along the way, they hit this storm that they're going, Jesus, help! He's sleeping because he knows we're going to the other side. Jesus, help us, we're going to drown. He gets up, calms the storm. You guys, where's your faith? What do you mean, where's your faith? Like, we're about to drown. The boat, they didn't have boats like we have. Think of maybe a 12-foot aluminum out in the ocean or something, okay? That might be an analogy for that. He said, we're going to the other side. And I just really felt like God, I felt him speaking to me about some stuff through that song this morning, He's going to bring us to the other side. I don't know if any of you need to hear that this morning, too, if you're going through some difficult stuff. Just that, you know what? If he said this is where we're going, he'll get you there. And sometimes in the middle of it, you go, how are we going to get there? No, he'll get you there. Okay? So, anybody else? Anything that God's speaking this morning that's appropriate for all of us to hear? Okay, let's stand together. So, as we always say, we'd invite you to come up for prayer if you'd like to receive prayer for any area. It might be your work situation. It might be, hey, what God spoke this morning really meant something to me, and I'd like to just receive prayer in terms of being that and doing that. Or you may want to grab somebody that's close to you this morning and have them pray for you. Maybe something completely unrelated where and I always hope that in these settings we can come together and pray for each other, because I really believe that prayer changes things. I really believe that God does something when we come together and say, okay, Lord, come and enter into this situation, do something. So let's do the song first, and then if you'd like to come up for prayer, we'd love to pray for you or grab someone that's around you. So let's do this song first.